Thank you everyone for joining us this afternoon. I'd like to welcome those who are here and also those who are online today for this special event to honour our friend and colleague, Associate Professor Helen O'Connor. Just wanted to point out some of the housekeeping notes before we get on to the speakers. First of all, if you've got a question for one of the presenters, we're having question time right at the end of the session, and we'll also have a panel where we can field questions for you. If you've got any technical issues, if you're online, you can use the Zoom chat for that, to contact our tech person. Also, we've got some Twitter handles set up there. And for the session contents and the timing of presentations, you can download the program using the QR code. We are recording the presentations today. So we'd also like to acknowledge the traditional custodianship and law of the country on which the University of Sydney campuses stand. We pay our respects to those who have cared for and continue to care for country. So I might not get a chance later. I also just wanted to thank Spartan for supporting this event, to Kieran Rooney for creating the opportunity and for being such an encouragement, and also to Isabel Cranfield for her organisational prowess and her patience, particularly of myself. Okay, so with that, I'd like to say a few words about Helen. So for those of you who may not have had the privilege to know Helen, she was a strong and significant leader in health and nutrition with incredible impact and reach. A friend and icon of the sports nutrition community, her teaching, mentoring and leadership sorry, did I just do something there? I'll just keep talking. A friend and icon of the sports nutrition community, her teaching, mentoring and leadership of industry organisations such as Sports Dietitians Australia made an important difference to many of her colleagues, students and industry peers. Helen was an Associate Professor in Nutrition within the discipline of Exercise and Sports Science, and many of the discipline are here today. She was in the Faculty of Health Sciences at the University of Sydney. She was certainly a very gifted teacher and very creative, and her students knew her for that. Helen's experience and list of achievements was vast. The sports nutrition landscape is forever changed and will continue to bear the fruits of Helen's hard work, imagination and inclusivity. So in honour of Helen today, we'll hear from a range of speakers celebrating women in research, sports dietetics and physical activity. We'll then hear from a leading ovarian cancer researcher, Dr. Christina Wharton. We'll take questions, as I said, at the end of all the presentations today. So please note any questions that you have down for yourself for later, or use the Zoom chat function, which is being monitored. We also hope to raise funds in Helen's honour for the Ovarian Cancer Research Foundation, and you can find the QR code to the donation page as well as badges to purchase at the end of today's proceedings. So now I'd like to introduce our first speaker, Nikki Jeacocke. Nikki is an accredited practicing dietitian, fellow of Sports Dietitians Australia, and credentialed eating disorder clinician with 19 years experience working in clinical, community and elite athlete contexts. She's the senior sports dietitian and disordered eating project lead at the Australian Institute of Sport. Today, Nikki is sharing her experience and expertise as the AIS Disordered Eating Project Lead, work that contributes to supporting the high performance system in Australia to prioritise health, athlete health and wellbeing. High performance sport can be paradoxical, often simultaneously holding a reputation for innovation and best practice, whilst also elevating traditional and time-tested methods. But in a time where athlete voices are emerging and being heard in a way that informs progressive thinking and a better future, many traditional practices are being challenged and culture change is occurring on many fronts. The title of her presentation today is Driving Culture Change in High Performance Sport, the AIS Disordered Eating Project. Welcome, Nikki.
Thank you very much, Janelle. Hello, everyone. What an honour it is to be here today with you at the Helen O'Connor Symposium for 2022. Helen was an incredible person. To me, Helen was kind. She was generous, wise, and knowledgeable. But she was also curious, looking for ways to learn more, know more, and do better. And she sparked curiosity in others. There's a wonderful episode of Ted Lasso that highlights the role of curiosity brilliantly. Now, for those of you who haven't seen the TV show before, Ted is an American football coach from America who is hired to coach an English soccer team in England. Now, he doesn't know the sport nor the country, and so the cultural differences make for some very amusing television. The scene that I'm referring to takes place in a quintessential English pub. And Ted, who is the head coach of the Richmond Football Club, is joined by Rebecca, the main owner of the club. Now, Rebecca's ex-husband, Rupert, appears, and he's quite unkind to Rebecca. And in the end, he wages a bet with Ted over a game of darts. Now, Rupert has clearly played darts before, and it appears that Ted has not. With 3 throws to go, Ted is well behind and he needs 3 amazing throws to win the game. As he throws each of those last 3 darts, the last one being a bullseye to win the game, he shares this quote, be curious, not judgmental. Because if Rupert had been curious, he might have asked Ted, have you played darts before? To which Ted would have replied, yes, sir. Every Sunday afternoon at the local sports club with my father from the ages 10 to 16. Clearly, Ted had played darts before, but Rupert was judgmental, not curious, made assumptions, and in the end, lost the game, lost the bet, and was pretty embarrassingly given a lesson in life. If we turn our attention and our curiosity towards the area of disordered eating and eating disorders, we might notice that athletes are speaking out about their mental health, and within that, body image concerns, disordered eating and eating disorders. And you'll see from the clips that I put up here, I've just picked a selection of a few. There are many more that I could have put up there. What you'll notice is they're different athletes from different sports and a range of voices that are speaking out. Some still within sport, some after they have left sport. And so while there are differences, there are also similarities between their stories. They're all talking about how their health, and within that their mental and physical health are impacted, how their well-being is impacted, and their performance. And the other similarities that we're hearing is that the culture within high-performance sport is playing a part. I often get asked, why am I so passionate about disordered eating and eating disorders in athletes? And if I may, I'd like to take you on a little journey and tell you a little bit about my story. When I first started as a dietitian, so little new grad dietitian, I was a clinical dietitian at the Canberra Hospital, and I loved the job, a really supportive nutrition department, and I got to really cut my teeth being a dietitian with a nice supportive team around me. Now, 9 to 5, Monday to Friday, 9 to 5, full department of dietitians. But on a Saturday, there was one dietitian that covered the entire hospital. And after a couple of months of working, it was my time to do a Saturday shift. And to say that I was nervous is probably a little bit of an understatement. And I remember thinking, there are 3 wards that I hope I don't get called to: the ICU, the neonatal ICU, and the paediatric ward. I kid you not. The clock had barely struck 10 a.m. My pager went off. I was needed on the paediatric ward. There was a new patient who'd just been admitted with an eating disorder, and I needed to go down, make contact with the patient, write up their nasogastric feeding rate, and then treatment could begin. So I took myself down to the paediatric ward, picked up the clinical notes, and I sat down at the nurse's station, and I did what every good clinical dietitian does, and I read the notes, cover to cover, front to back, again and again. Now, this patient hadn't been admitted for very long, so the notes weren't very long, but I wanted to make sure I didn't miss everything, and I read it again, cover to cover. After a little while, a nurse approached the nurse's station. Let's call her Jane. Jane said, "Are you the dietitian?" I said, "Yes, I am. Nikki, nice to meet you." Clearly nervous. Jane looked at me and she said, "You've been sitting there for a while." I said, "Yes, I have." She said, "I'm just wondering how long until you're heading in to see the patient. I really need to start this feeding regime." And I thought, I've got a couple of options here, but I'm like, you know what? I think honesty is my best policy. I said, "I'm nervous. This is my first time working with a patient with an eating disorder. I don't want to say the wrong thing." And she looked at me with a kind, wise, and knowledgeable smile. And she said, "Very noble of you. However, the longer you sit out here, the longer till I can start the feeding. And well, the longer you sit out here, actually, the more harm you're doing." So I smiled, I got up, I walked in, I had the chat with the patient, I came back out, I wrote in the clinical notes, thanked the nurse, and I left. And I felt absolutely atrocious. In not wanting to make things worse, I had delayed treatment and made things worse. Now, be it by not many hours, but I still didn't feel very good. And so I walked away and I said, I don't want to ever feel that again. So I read, I researched, I picked the paediatric dietitians' brains, I shadowed them around, and I got to a point where I was actually one of the paediatric dietitians, and I was part of the treatment team for inpatients who were admitted onto the paediatric ward. Great. Time came for me to leave my clinical role. I had always wanted to be a sports dietitian. And so I was really excited for my new adventure. Sad to leave, but excited for my new adventure. And I will never forget the first athlete I saw who was living with an eating disorder. He came to our consult, her parents brought her, and I vividly remember the look in their eye. Apologies, I've done well to get this far. It still gets me this many years later. The parents and the look in their eye of fear, of desperation, but also of hope. And I just desperately, desperately wished I had a magic wand that I could wave to make it better for this athlete, but also for her family. Now, unfortunately, I didn't have a magical wand, and I felt myself right back where I was all those years ago as that new grad, a couple of years as that new grad dietitian, helpless all over again, not wanting to make things worse. But this was different. I'd gotten used to inpatients, having a team around me, working with eating disorders. This was now an athlete out in the community, and I didn't have that support team around me. And so I went back to the drawing board again, read, researched, attended PD sessions, talked to experts. And the more I learnt and the more my knowledge improved, the more I was seeing disordered eating and eating disorders within my athletes. But at the same time, I was often being told, you can't sustain high performance and have an eating disorder at the same time. And so I found it a little hard because I was seeing things. Sorry, I'll keep going. You signed out, Louise. All good? No, you're fine. So I was seeing things, but there was this lack of understanding. And so I thought, really need to do more here, and we need to understand this more. So what I'd love to share with you today is how being curious has led to the Disordered Eating Project, and within that, how we're trying to change the culture within high performance sport. When you have health, then ongoing and sustained performance takes care of itself. All right, we've jumped ahead. Or did I do that? Okay, all good. All right, so what I would like to do now is have a look at the problem. So let's talk through what the problem is, what we've done about it, and how we're trying to drive that culture change. So up on the screen, you can see the spectrum of eating behavior. And I really love this figure. I love that it puts disordered eating and eating disorders together on a page, but you can really see the difference between them. So if you have a look at the left, your left, my right, optimized nutrition in the green. So this is ideally what we'd love everyone to sit. And sorry, I should say, so all athletes sit on the spectrum of eating behavior. All humans sit on the spectrum of eating behavior. What we'd love to see is everyone sitting here over in the green zone. Safe, supported, purposeful, and individualized nutrition practices that best balance health and performance. Wouldn't that be lovely? As we move along the spectrum, you can see then in the yellowy orange, we've got disordered eating. So problematic eating behaviors that fail to meet the clinical diagnosis for an eating disorder. Examples of some behaviors here might include skipping meals, compulsive exercising, restrictive eating. And as you can see then into the red, we have eating disorders. So this is behavior that meets DSM-5 diagnostic criteria for a feeding and eating disorder. So as you can see, there's a strong relationship between them. Now, as someone moves, sorry, are you seeing that pointer? Oh, good. I can't see it for the life of me, that's all right. As we move along this spectrum of eating behavior, there are signs and symptoms, red flags, warning signs as someone moves along here. So we don't see someone waking up overnight in the red zone. Does that make sense? There are signs and symptoms as someone's moving along here. And so a key component is early identification of movement along this spectrum so that we can put timely and appropriate interventions in place to help move someone back along the spectrum of eating behavior. So ideally, what we're really trying to do is prevent eating disorders. Oh, sorry, I should have put my little clicker there. Again, ideally, preventing eating disorder, but moving someone back down. There are two disclaimers that I do just want to put on my statement, which was people don't wake up overnight in the red zone, and that's adolescents and those with a history of experiencing trauma. They can move very quickly along this spectrum of eating behavior, and so a sit and wait and watch approach with those individuals is not appropriate. So just need to disclaimer it. As a sports dietitian, I use this spectrum all the time. I love this. Every one of my athletes, I plot on the spectrum of eating behavior. I know where they sit now. I'm aiming to identify where they sit now, where they've sat in the past, and where it might be a normal space for them. Now, those 3 time points could be very similar, but they could also be far apart. An example I could give there was an athlete that I'm seeing with an injury, second ACL, and I identify that I think they're probably sitting about here. But the way they talk about their eating behavior and their exercise behavior when they first did the injury probably had them sitting up here. And normally I might think they're plotting that they might sit here. So does it make sense that this is really useful for me in terms of getting a sense of what is it like for my athlete? What is their eating behaviors like? And where do they sit on the spectrum of eating behavior? And what might be triggers or things that move them along the spectrum that I need to keep an eye out for? If we turn now and have a look at prevalence, so how much of a problem is it? From within the literature, I must say we don't have the greatest of prevalence rates on Australian athletes. But if we look at the literature, and there was a IOC mental health summary statement from 2019, Reardon and Friends, the numbers that come up in there are 0 to 19% for male athletes. Now, this is disordered eating and eating disorders, 0 to 19% in males, and 6 to 45% in female athletes. So that's quite a range within male and female, and then between. And I think it's really important that this isn't just, and I do that with quotation marks, quote unquote, this isn't just a female athlete issue. This affects males and females as well. Within the prevalence data, if we then have a look with athletes compared to non-athlete matched controls, most of the time within the literature, we see a higher prevalence rates rate amongst athletes. And then within athletes, there are 3 categories of sports that have a higher prevalence. And they are gravitational sports, aesthetically judged sports, and weight class sports. Now, in saying that, so within athletes that there are high risk categories, I really do want to re-emphasize that disordered eating and eating disorders can occur in any athlete, in any sport, and at any time. So why might it be that athletes have a higher prevalence than the general population? I first want to take a step to the side, if I may, and talk about risk factors for all humans in relation to developing eating disorders. So you can see here from the figure that there is no one single cause of an eating disorder. It's a multifactorial and complex interaction between genetics, psychology, and socio-cultural and environmental influences. So that's general population. Then from an analogy there, there's a number of analogies that are used for those 3. One that I like to use is around fire. So heat, oxygen, fuel. So biology, the heat, psychology, the oxygen, and the social influences being the fuel. And for our athletes, there are then sports-specific factors within the socio-cultural and environmental influences that are like extra fuel to the fire. So what are some examples of things that mean our athletes have these extra sport-specific factors? It could be the type of sport, and I've just highlighted those 3 that might be different. It could be weighing, body composition monitoring and assessment, dieting within the context of performance and trying to get better. And it also can be different and alternative body image pressures for athletes to general population. Sorry, that was very loud. Apologies, everyone. I should have covered that. Okay, so bit of a putting it in perspective as to what I'm talking about and why it's of importance. So what have we done? So at the AIS, we worked out that there was something here. We needed to know a bit more. So we decided, there we go. We knew they were occurring in sport, but really unsure of the extent. So what we decided to do was gather some data. Let's do some exploratory research, and we put together a pilot survey of coaches and sports science, sports medicine service providers. And we were looking at really understanding their experience, their thoughts around disordered eating and eating disorders within their athletes. There were some really interesting findings that came out of that pilot survey. There were 5 key areas that I'll talk you through. The first one was that policies relating to disordered eating and eating disorders were either non-existent or unclear. So a lot of responses were, no, we don't have policies. And then what we were finding within responses who said, yes, we do have a policy, that respondents from within the same sport disagreed. So one person might say, yes, we have a policy, and then someone from the same sport said, no, we don't. So the policies were either non-existent or it was clearly a bit unclear as to whether there was one or not. So that was the first outcome. The second outcome was that coaches and service providers identified that disordered eating and eating disorder behaviours were prevalent or occurring within their athletes and within their sport. The third thing that we found was that many respondents had a poor understanding of a number of key issues in relation to disordered eating and eating disorders. And I'll give you an example. There was a real lack of understanding of what is disordered eating and how it's relating to eating disorders. So comments for disordered eating around, well, it's just disorganized eating, or it's just a lack of education, or just a lack of discipline, and a real poor understanding, if we look and think back to that spectrum, that they actually exist on a spectrum together. They're actually related. And if you take that whole disordered eating section out of the spectrum, there's this green to red zone, and we're missing this whole space for early identification and movement along that spectrum. So that was a really big finding, that there were some key areas that were really poorly understood. The fourth thing that we found was that measurements of body mass and body composition were being performed regularly within athletes, but that the practices won't be ideal, that the practices may not have been ideal. And the fifth thing that we found was that education in the area of disordered eating and eating disorders for coaches and performance support staff was either outdated or non-existent. So some people, yep, at uni many, many years ago, we touched on it briefly. So you can see from those 5 outcomes, we really realized that there was something in it and we needed to do some more research and some more work in the space. So from the pilot survey, we then decided to write a position statement. So it's called Disordered Eating in High Performance Sport. And we partnered with the National Eating Disorders Collaboration, see them up at the top, or the NEDC, sorry, I will keep reverting to the acronym probably. So NEDC is a federally funded organisation. They're experts in the ED space. So it was a really nice and natural alignment for us to partner with the NEDC for this. So within the position statement, it was a literature review. Oh, that was a mumble, literature review. It was an overview of the literature, what's there. But at the same time, we were also making recommendations for what sporting organisations within Australia might do to address the issue. Now, the position statement was released September 2020. As we were writing it though, and we were recommending, sporting organisations should have policy and education and this and that, our sporting organisations are saying to us, that's great, but where are the examples of these things? And so given that there was nothing off the shelf that we could just take and roll out to the high performance sporting environment, we needed to do a bit of work to create the resources that we were suggesting within the position statement. So in terms of outputs of resources to support the position statement, I'm going to talk you through the 3 main ones. So the first output was a policy template on prevention and management of disordered eating and eating disorders within athletes. And so this is a template of a policy that sporting organisations can take. They can modify it, edit, make additions, subtractions to make it relevant to their organisation, their sport, their athletes, but that the bulk of the work was done. Now, within the position statement, we recommended all sporting organisations within Australia have a policy. At the moment, and as it stands, there are a number who now have policies in this space, and there are many more who have theirs in, final review sign-off phases. So we're starting to see more and more sporting organisations releasing their policies in this space. The second resource was a body composition assessment guideline. Remember, I said from the pilot survey that we were aware it was being done, but that potentially practices weren't ideal. So these guidelines give sporting organisations some guidance around things like consent, communication, confidentiality, clinical context. And the idea being that sporting organisations could either just adopt the AIS guidelines or they could modify them slightly and create their own. Now, the body composition assessment guidelines are referenced within the policy, but because there's a bit more guts to it, if that makes sense, we sat it beside it. So they reference each other, but sit as separate documents. The third output, excuse me, was the creation of an education workshop. So we call this Eating Disorders in Sport, or EDIS for short. And EDIS is developed, and sorry, once again, we partnered with the NEDC to develop, pilot and evaluate EDIS. So EDIS, it's a 4-hour workshop designed for coaches and all performance support staff within high performance sport. So that's every role holder, board directors, CEOs, high performance managers, SSM, front of house, HR, etc. So everyone within high performance sport, except for the athlete and their support network. And I'll talk more about that in a sec. So within eating disorders in sport, we're very much talking prevention and early identification and highlighting what each individual's role is within that space. So what we're trying to do is we're trying to work people and we're trying to teach people to work up to their professional capacity, but not beyond. EDIS is facilitated by a sports dietitian and a psychologist. And as of February 2022, we have 26 clinicians from around the country who've been trained to deliver EDIS. And so far, we've had over 100 coaches and performance support staff attend EDIS workshops, with many more attending in the near future. So, as you can see, there's a bit of a natural progression there from the pilot survey to the position statement to then these resources being created. And what we're really working towards here is culture change. And how do we drive culture change within high performance sport? So I'm going to talk now about language, because I think language is a key part of this culture change piece. And within EDIS, we do a deep dive into language for our coaches and performance support staff. So why language and why is it important? Athletes' bodies are their tools. I think everyone would agree with that. There is a lot of scrutiny over athletes' bodies. We measure, we monitor, we test, we talk about, we discuss their bodies a lot. And there's some problematic ways we can talk about athletes' bodies, and we need to talk about that. So I'll give you an example. This is probably one of my most biggest pet hates is they look good. How many times do we hear athletes being told they look good? General population, to be honest, it's quite a common, gee, you look good today. It's very common words that we hear in sport and in society. Now, why is that problematic? It doesn't tell you anything, does it? What does that mean? Now, I raised that question with a group of coaches recently, and one of the coaches was really quite surprised that I used that as an example. They said, oh, Nikki, I use that all the time. I'm a water polo coach, and I tell my athletes all the time, you looked good in the water, or you look good in the water, past or present. I'm really, really shocked that you've done that. I use it as a coaching and a technical, feedback. What do I do? Like, where do we go? I said, look, could we unpack that a little bit more? She said, yes, absolutely. I said to her, so tell me, what do you mean by that? And she said, well, what I mean is they were showing really great height in the water. They were sitting in a really good position. So when they were attacking, they had a really good position and were able to get a really good shot at goal, more leverage, but also in defensive, it could be used in either. They had a lot of height in the water, presence was great, and a really good defensive position. And I smiled and I said, then that is exactly what you were trying to say. So my tips for my coaches around that is, rather than that subjective appearance based, it's the performance objective based. And because it's really not about what I'm saying, I know what I'm saying, I know what I mean, but it's about the listener and what they hear. And I guarantee this, the water polo player in the pool who's told you look great today is probably thinking, I look really good in my togs today. They're probably not thinking about the technical feedback that the coach is actually trying to give. And you never know what the body image, thoughts, processes, eating behaviours is going on for that person and what potentially we're negatively reinforcing in them. And I also do reflect that for the person standing, sitting in the water beside them, who you don't say, you looked great in the water today, what are they also then thinking? Oh, I didn't look great in my togs today. And then what negative body image, eating behaviours are you potentially reinforcing for them? So language is a big, big part and a big key in this culture change space. If I look then to some future research and some direction, I think there's a lot that can be done. There's a lot being done, but I think there's still a lot that we can do. So things like better prevalence in Australian athletes, I think that's a key, and I think that's really important. The impact and the effectiveness of our education programs. Are they doing what we want them to do? Are they working? Differences in the treatment approaches for athletes compared to general populations, I think that's a really interesting one. The unique challenges that our athletes face within the sporting environment, and those contributing and maintaining factors that are the sport specific. I think there's a lot that we can learn in that space. And the athlete lived experience. I think there is so much more for us to learn by listening to athletes and their lived experience. So in terms of culture change, we've really taken this whole of sport approach. And I think you'd all agree that it's not just one area that we need to change, it's a whole of sport approach that we need to take. You'll see from the sport culture and environment, if they're around like policies and environment, we've been addressing those. The coach, performance support staff and technical official education is super duper important. Athlete engagement and education, I haven't mentioned that yet. And I must say, when I first started this work, I thought it was probably the most important. Surely the athlete, they're who we're trying to help. They are the most important in this piece. Had some really wise words said to me, which is you can create a really resilient athlete, but if the system around them isn't aware and isn't understanding, then all your hard work with the athlete is done. And I think that was really, really wise. So at the moment, huge amount of work currently being done on the athlete education piece. And then the support networks, super important as well, and they're next to come. So lots of work that's been done, but there is still a lot of work to go. So my journey and growth from that nervous and hesitant new grad dietitian has been massive. Whilst I still don't have a magic wand and I can't magically make disordered eating and eating disorders disappear, I do see a different future. Imagine a world where the only stories we're hearing from our elite athletes is about their positive experiences, and this is both past and current athletes, talking about their positive experiences within high performance sport in relation to their body image and their eating behaviours. But driving culture change takes time and it takes patience. And like Ted suggested, we need to be curious and not judgmental. But I would also add to this, we also need to be courageous and curious and courageous, to question what might have always been done and accepted to be true. Curious and courageous to accept when things might need improving and be willing to do the hard work needed to change. Helen, by being curious and courageous, has left a legacy that has had and continues to have a major impact. May we all be as curious and courageous. Now, before I finish, I do just want to recognise that talking about disordered eating, body image disordered eating, eating disorders, it is a sensitive topic. And things that I've talked about may have raised issues with people either here, in person, or online. So if anything I've spoken about has raised concerns for you, please reach out to the Butterfly National Helpline. It's open 8 a.m. to midnight, 7 days a week, 1-800-ED-HOPE. There is an online chat function and you can also email them. Thank you, Janelle and team, for the invitation to be here today. And to everyone here in person and online, it's been an honour and an absolute privilege. Thank you.
Thanks, Nikki. I'm sure you'll agree that was an absolutely wonderful presentation. And it's not something that we hear about very much or at all. And I'm really pleased that Nikki could join us today to share that work with us. And hopefully that changes our view on athletes and the work that needs to be done in that area. Okay, welcome back, everybody. This afternoon's session will consist of 3 briefer presentations, and then we're going to do a Q&A slash panel discussion with all the speakers involved. So the next speaker is actually myself. I'll introduce myself. So I'm a sports dietitian and I work in the discipline of exercise and sports science at the university. And today I'm introducing the Accelerated Sports Nutrition Assessment Platform, otherwise known as ASNAP. And this was a project that was led by Associate Professor Helen O'Connor. And I'm presenting on behalf of Drs. Ryan Tam and Louise Capling, whose tools, the 2 tools, are housed on the ASNAP platform. Oh, and I'm also presenting on behalf of the ASNAP team, which you'll meet in a moment. So I wanted to start with this slide to kind of set the scene. I can see somebody smiling in the audience. This was from one of Helen's presentations from 15 years ago. And the presentation, hopefully I get this right. Oh, it's on the slide anyway. Sports nutrition challenges and innovations for effective practice. So Helen had an amazing, and some would say a wild imagination, and I heard her talk about tricorders to measure nutrition deficiencies on more than one occasion. This slide was actually at the last slide of the presentation, and she was encouraging the audience to go on a nutrition trek boldly where no one had been before. So a little bit of background here. In sports dietetics, and a few of you could probably attest to this, there's a large athlete to dietitian ratio. And so there tends to be a lot of group education or without, probably mostly without evaluation of any change in knowledge or dietetic behaviour. There's also been no screening tools that I know of, at least, to triage athletes who are most in need of intervention. So you'll see that this series of work started around the time of that presentation that I mentioned, and Helen developed quite a large body of work around assessment of athlete nutrition knowledge and diet quality. And you'll see that Ryan and Louise's projects there are there in blue there. Okay, so fast forward to around mid-2019, and some ignition grants were announced to support or give seeding funds to support research between the faculty. So the faculty was providing an amount of money, and it was to support collaborative work with an industry partner. So Helen quickly realised the opportunity with this, and ASNAP was born, or it has been a slow pregnancy and a recent birth. So Helen got together with Gary Slater from the AIS to develop this proposal, which was to, first of all, act as the last data collection point for Ryan and Louise, and also to, in doing that, have their two tools on a dedicated website where the data could be collected, but also to provide a practical resource for dietitians where the athletes would get some automated feedback, and dietitians would get feedback as well to help to support the athlete. Additionally, we wanted to facilitate the transfer of data to the AIS to go with other data that was collected for ongoing assessment of athletes. So this is the ASNAP team. You'll see some familiar faces there on the board. I also wanted to acknowledge Professor Gareth Denyer, who was really instrumental in the early versions of the tools on iPads using FileMaker Pro. You'll also see several organisations that were involved in this project too. And I particularly wanted to highlight High Performance Sport in New Zealand, especially Tanya Hamilton and Jenny Pearce, who facilitated data collection for Ryan's reliability study for his sports nutrition knowledge assessment tool. Also, the Queensland Government, Queensland Academy of Sport, provided a research grant to Louise to support her work. Oops, we'll go back. So now I'm going to use the mouse here. This is going to take us to the website, so you can have a bit of a peek. So this is the website housed on the University of Sydney internet site, and you can see very clearly a description of the tools, and also links to the ADI, that's the Athlete Diet Index, and the peaks and Qs, so the platform to evaluate athlete knowledge sports nutrition questionnaire. Okay, so I better not delve into that too much because I'm going to run out of time, but you should be able to go there and have a bit of a look yourself. So both tools have three parts, one of which is demographics. And for the nutrition knowledge tool, You'll see two sections. One's on general nutrition, so along the lines of population guidelines, and the other on sports nutrition specifically. This currently takes 15 minutes to complete. It did take longer. We had some analysis done thanks to Associate Professor Justin Scanlon, who helped us with some rash analysis to determine discriminating questions. So this is the report that comes from the Peaks NQ, and that gives an overall score and two other scores, one on general nutrition, looking at macro and micronutrients, and the second on specifically on sports nutrition. And this report goes to both the athlete and the dietitian. Oh, I just wanted to point out before I go back there, the database currently has almost 1,000 completions, completed surveys. The Athlete Diet Index also looks at core nutrition and performance nutrition, but in a different way. So with this questionnaire, there's quite a complex scoring matrix underlying this to look at dietary intake and dietary behaviours, so things like eating takeaway foods and so on. And the performance nutrition section is as it sounds, but it also collects information like training load, injuries and so on for the dietitian to, I guess, assess the information in the context of those different bits of information. So there are two reports that come out from this tool. There's an athlete report, and that also gives an overall score, and in this case recommends for the person to see a sports dietitian, and it gives detailed information. So in this case, oops. Yeah. So in this case, explaining that the vegetable intake is below recommendation, but also saying that the vegetables that are being eaten are of a good variety. So again, we've got almost 500 completions in our database right now. This is the dietitian report, and you can see that that's a lot more detailed. There's a maximum score and an athlete score on core nutrition, and then specifically on performance. The other information is also provided to the dietitian to help with providing context and in speaking with the athlete when they see them. So how do we do against our initial proposal? And you can see there are a few ticks there, but there is one cross, and that is the large cross-sectional study didn't actually occur. It can occur in the future, I suppose, but in this case, we were aiming to collect information for the completion of Ryan and Louise's PhD. There were some administrative issues where we couldn't implement this, we couldn't get the website together in time for their PhDs to finish, to complete. Their submission time just kept creeping up, and we didn't have the tools ready on that dedicated website. We did actually implement the tools separately on the internet for the athletes to complete. The last point has been very difficult, facilitation of the data transfer to the AIS, and I hope that we're almost there with that. We had plenty of hurdles, and I'm sure most people will empathise with the COVID-19 pandemic and the impact that had on research, but also in this case, because we're talking about academics, the impact on the time involved with teaching changes and so on. Okay, so in our case, though, a little bit different. We had a faculty merger also happening at the same time. So we were at home trying to work out who we were supposed to contact and using role-based accounts, and if people had moved on or whatever, it was very difficult to actually move forward with this. And one of the first things was actually getting access to the finance, from the grant. There have been other things that we need to work through. Probably the next thing was looking at IP and the students' IP and software disclosures, things that I'd never heard of before that we needed to very quickly get across. We talked about whether to use it, to have a subscription for the tools, and that was very complicated. We never ended up doing that, or not yet anyway. Because the tools are available globally. There's also, we had to meet the highest privacy policy standards because, well, the highest policy in the world, basically, we had to have that because all sorts of people would be accessing it. We had plenty of technical issues. Our IT partner, Mohammed at Islam, was really helpful in helping us to overcome those. And now we have addressed some of the legal issues. We're still kind of dealing with that. Licensing agreements, data sharing agreements, confidentiality agreements, and the list kind of goes on. And there were the usual finance hurdles as well. So at the end of the day, we've got some fantastic tools, 2 fantastic tools. The ASNAP website is wonderful, and hopefully, we can move forward with that. But it has been very, very time consuming and very difficult to disseminate the research, unfortunately. We've had some really great impact with this work, and with Helen leading specifically, there've been quite a large number of articles, a very healthy citation rate, and a very, very healthy mean citation rate as well. Brian and Louise's PhD publications, or 8 of those 22 that you can see there, 137 citations and counting, because they've been published more recently, I suppose, in a lot of those articles, those early articles. And very proud to say that the 2 systematic reviews have been published in very high impact factor journals, and the field weighted citation index is quite good too. Well, very good, let's say. You might not have seen this little figure here. It's a Plumex metric, and what this indicates is citations in the orange. Oh, social media, sorry, go back there. Social media attention in the blue. We've got in the green is usages, so that's downloads, and in the purple is captures, so that's things like bookmarking and so on. And in the yellow, we've got mentions in news items or blogs. Okay, so very, very good work. In terms of where it's used now, it's publicly available, of course. Anyone can access it. I've encouraged our students to access it and have a look and see how they score. And it's also being used across Australia in sports institutes. We hope to have more broad use in terms of triaging athletes who need attention first, and just to provide a more efficient service with the few resources that are there. There is plenty of research potential. I've got a couple of examples there, but hopefully we can do something bigger and better, so to infinity and beyond. There has been a large number of people, who have contributed to this project, well, all the projects really, and hopefully I've captured most of the people there who have helped us, but I'm sure that there are others. So thanks to the team. All right, now I'm finishing my speaker hat and getting my MC hat on, and I'd like to introduce Geraldine Wallbank. Geraldine is a PhD candidate in the Sydney School of Public Health and the Institute for Musculoskeletal Health. She has a background in physiotherapy, and her work focuses on supporting independence and preventing disability in older age by promoting physical activity in the middle-aged years. Geraldine led the Active Women Over 50 online project trial, and she'll present the results of that trial, which evaluated the feasibility, acceptability, and possible effect of an online physical activity information and support program for women aged 50 and over. welcome to Geraldine.
Thanks, Janelle, and thank you to Spartan for this invitation. It's an honour to present this work at the 2022 Helen O'Connor Symposium, so thanks for that. So as Janelle mentioned, that this work that I'm going to talk about today is one of the projects of my PhD. Oh, sorry. So first of all, I'd like to start by acknowledging the team who are behind this project. We've got a varied and wide team of academics and clinicians across lots of different faculties and disciplines. So I'd like to thank them and my fantastic PhD supervisors and other additional support as well. So first of all, I'd like to start by introducing you to Libby Long, who's a fictitious character, but she's a middle-aged 53-year-old woman, and people of a newspaper reading generation might recognise her more famous twin as Kathy. Libby's got no noteworthy medical conditions, but she's a member of the sandwich generation. She cares for her elderly mother. She cares for her teenage children. She works 4 days a week. She volunteers within the local school community. Libby's partner is a shift worker as a nurse. So in the past, Libby was quite active. She enjoyed swimming, but that all sort of went by the wayside when she had children and had different work opportunities come up along the way, and her mother had different caring needs as well. Libby knows that she could be healthier, but at the moment, between juggling her family and her work commitments, she really doesn't know how she could really fit that in, or she doesn't know where to start. So there are many challenges that face our friend Libby with being regular in her physical activity, and she doesn't quite know where to start. So we're going to revisit Libby at the end of this talk to see how an online physical activity program might support her. Just to give you a sense of the size of the problem of physical inactivity, each year, globally, 1.6 million deaths are attributable to insufficient physical activity. And this costs the health systems $67.5 international billion. We know that physical activity benefits physical and mental health, and this is an audience that doesn't need that type of convincing, but on the right is an infographic that shows just the benefits of physical activity in different aspects of physical health and mental health. And we know there's a wealth of evidence that sufficient regular physical activity has a protective effect against chronic diseases, and it can enhance mobility and delay physical disability in older age if commenced in earlier years. WHO and governments around the world have established clear guidance on the minimum amounts of physical activity for health benefits. But there's a mismatch between the evidence for and the global problem of participation in physical activity to achieve these health benefits. Women in their middle age face unique barriers, and they may struggle to be physically active due to competing demands in their lives, such as care responsibilities, work commitments, or health conditions. And as such, this population needs a supported and targeted approach to adopt and sustain physical activity to achieve these health benefits. So we pilot tested the online Active Women Over 50 program to establish the acceptability, the feasibility, and likely impact on physical activity of women aged 50 plus. You can access the published results of the study via this link. This is a flowchart of the pilot study. Participants were community dwelling women aged 50 plus who were able to participate in regular physical activity but weren't meeting the minimum WHO guidelines for recommended physical activity. Participants were randomised to receive the intervention immediately or to a waitlist control group who received the program after a 3-month delay. The intervention was a 3-month behaviour change program designed with end user input and delivered remotely. The program gave participants access to the Active Women Over 50 website, regular motivational based messages, and a telephone health coaching support, all which could be accessed flexibly. The outcome measurements for acceptability are shown here, and we took a global measure of acceptability. So that was the likelihood of participants recommending participation in this study to other people, such as themselves. And there are other measures of acceptability of the intervention features shown here on the slide. We used process indicators to measure feasibility of study methods and the retention as shown on this slide. And keeping in mind that this was a pilot study, we took device and survey measurements of the likely impact on physical activity. To give you a sense of the intervention, this is the look of the website. It was designed for the population and guided by user input and was market tested. The main pages of the website included the Why Be Active page, How to Be Active page, which suggested a variety of opportunities and skills, and the Be Inspired page, which offered motivation through video case studies, podcasts, and role modelling. In terms of messaging, on the left is an example of the motivational based email messages that were sent, and on the right are examples of the SMS messages. The messages delivered the same content, and there were links embedded within the text to direct people back to the website for further information and access to the motivational stories. The intervention participants received 1 session of telephone health coaching, which was offered for some personalised input and tailoring of the intervention by a physiotherapist who is trained in delivering behaviour change interventions. And in reporting our results, this slide shows the baseline characteristics of the participants. The mean age was 59 years old. Most lived in the city, and most had 2 or more medical conditions. In the results, there was high global acceptability of the study. 83% of the participants would recommend participation in the study to others. This graph shows the high proportion who took up each component of the program. There was a median of 3 days response time from being offered the intervention to accepting the intervention. The top bar shows the website access. So people access the website almost 5 times per internet connected device. And each time they accessed it for about 6 minutes. 87% of participants accepted the motivational messages, and it was about 50-50 between who accepted email and SMS. We were able to track the engagement with the emails. So 80% of the messages were opened, and 1/3 of the embedded links were clicked upon. And 81% of people accepted the telephone health coaching session. So what did the participants look at on the website? This shows the website pages. The most viewed pages were the main pages, but a few sub-pages underneath that. And down the bottom there, it shows where people exited, and they seem to exit the website around pages that provided information on action planning or finding an activity or strategy to keep being active. In the participant survey, feedback survey, overall participants were positive about physical activity and the intervention. And most people described this as that the intervention helped them to raise their awareness and encourage them to be more active. But the program didn't suit all participants. Some were looking for a personal trainer, and some people were looking for an intervention that offered more face-to-face interaction. 44% described their physical activity was higher at follow-up, and 80% had set a physical activity goal. Most people said that the website was easy to navigate and found that the health coaching helped their physical activity. And there were, of course, some barriers that were outlined as well. In terms of the feasibility of the intervention, recruitment was on a first-come basis. Of those people who were eligible, there were 2/3 who consented, and 15% of these people lived regionally. And we had a retention rate of 96%. And delivery also appeared feasible as well. There was a delay, from replying to the invitation to having a health coaching session, there was a 6-day period of a delay, which actually isn't a delay, it was actually quite a quick intervention. The sessions of the health coaching lasted for about 41 minutes, and within a session, the health coaches made quite a few recommendations for physical activity. Here's just a summary of the likely impact of the intervention. So there was a between group difference for the proportion of those who took 2,000 or more daily steps than what they did at baseline, favouring the intervention group. And compared to the control group, there was a tendency for people to be spending more time in light intensity physical activity and increase their physical activity, moderate to vigorous physical activity by about 2 hours a week. And in summary, from participants' feedback and the uptake of the program, we can see that women over 50 are motivated to participate in this type of program. It's a scalable online program. It was acceptable, feasible, and effective in some domains of physical activity. And there's further testing in a fully powered trial, which is warranted. I just wanted to leave you with this positive and realistic image of physical activity, which emphasises the benefit of overall health rather than body shape, and the benefits of that. Thanks for your attention.
Thanks very much, Geraldine. Very interesting and topical and relevant presentation. Thank you. I'd like to now introduce Christina Wharton. She completed her PhD at the University of New South Wales and has since worked on breast cancer, cervical cancer, and ovarian cancer. She's published extensively in the field of circulating cell-free DNA. Dr. Wharton is currently leading a project within the Gynecological Cancer Research Group to develop a blood test for the early diagnosis of ovarian cancer based on methylation of cell-free DNA in blood plasma. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for that introduction. I can't tell you how much I'm loving being part of this symposium and bringing the material outside of a cancer audience and how it's given me a fresh perspective on what we're doing. So our group is the Gynecological Cancer Research Group. We are based at the University of New South Wales at the Lowy Cancer Research Centre. The group is led by Associate Professor Caroline Ford, and we have several different projects under our umbrella, including studies of endometrial cancer, endometriosis, and ovarian cancer. As Janelle said, my project in particular is about developing an early diagnostic test, but I'm going to tell you a little bit about how our research pathway evolved, in particular through collaborations with hospital clinical staff. So why develop a diagnostic test for ovarian cancer? Out of all the gynecological cancers, and by gynecological cancers, we mean below the waist, so cervical cancer, vulval cancer, endometrial cancer, and so on, ovarian cancer has the worst outcomes. A big contributing factor is that it's a cancer that's generally speaking diagnosed quite late because early stages are asymptomatic. What happens with cancer, and this goes across all the solid tumors, is that cancer cells are descended from each other. And as they divide and replicate, they copy the DNA sequence errors of the preceding cells and then also introduce some new mutations of their own. And as this is happening, the result is a lump of cells that are dividing faster than they should be. If the cancer is diagnosed early and that lump can be surgically removed, effectively there's no more cells left to give rise to new cancer cells, and in practice it's a cure without chemotherapy. So this is a very desirable goal for cancer screenings. Effective cancer screening is very desirable and effective. So what are we doing to create a diagnostic test for ovarian cancer? Our approach has been to use circulating cell-free DNA in blood plasma. What we can see on screen there, well, a blood tube, after it's been centrifuged, spun around in a centrifuge to bring the cells which are denser to the bottom and the liquid that's less dense to the top. The very bottom layer there that you can see is the red blood cells. They don't have any DNA. Then there's a layer of white blood cells in the middle of the tube. They're responsible for the immune response. And at the top is the plasma fluid. The plasma fluid doesn't contain any cells, but what's been found is that it does contain DNA from cells that have died. So it leaves a DNA footprint of cell turnover in the body. For a person with a tumor, this cell footprint includes cancer cells. And because cancer DNA has the mutation, it's different. If we can detect mutations or other changes, in our case, methylation, which is a way of regulating gene expression, then we may be able to determine whether somebody has cancer or not from a simple non-invasive blood test. Our approach is extremely straightforward. We're working with patients from the Royal Hospital for Women in Randwick, and we approach patients as they come in for diagnosis, ask them if they would like to participate in this study, and if they consent, then we collect 2 tubes of blood when the patients go to have their monitoring blood tests taken at pathology. We extract DNA from the blood plasma, and we use in-lab methods to look at the methylation pattern. In parallel, we are collecting blood from women from within the community for our healthy volunteer blood donors, and we do the same thing. So we centrifuge the blood, collect the plasma, extract DNA, and look at the methylation pattern. We then compare the methylation pattern to look for differences, and the differences are the basis of the blood test. So I'll give you a little bit of background about cell-free DNA so that, to put some context for our approach. DNA in cells is very, very long. Each one of the cells in the body has about 2 meters of DNA. It's huge, it's taller than I am. The DNA is very carefully packaged so that the cell can manage it. And the way that it's packaged is by wrapping it around proteins, which are called nucleosomes. This is an electron micrograph, and those little spots that you can see, the long parts are the DNA, and the little spots are the nucleosomes that package it. When a cell dies, the DNA is broken between the nucleosomes, and this creates fragments of a regular size, because the length that can be wrapped around a single nucleosome is consistent. That's the DNA there as we visualize it by size and measure size. Now, what we're using to detect our cancer-specific DNA is PCR, which many people will be familiar with from a COVID detection context. And when we create a PCR assay, we can't have it spanning a break between the chromosomes. So if the PCR assay goes there, it won't work. Now, we know that it won't work empirically just simply because when we try to run it, we will get no results. But ideally, we would be able to do this in a more sensible and targeted way. So as I said, we collect blood samples from women at the Royal Hospital for Women. And the next very exciting part of the project was once again initiated by one of the nurses there, Jenny Duggan, who said to me one day, Christina, you hang around a lot looking to collect blood samples. Do you know that we have all this ascites fluid that we're throwing away? And ascites fluid is a particular symptom of ovarian cancer, which is essentially fluid that accumulates in the abdominal cavity. So there's a figure of the abdominal cavity there, and in about 30% of newly diagnosed ovarian cancer patients, this is a presenting symptoms, and it manifests as abdominal distension. One of the significant things for ovarian cancer is that most other organs like breast cancer, in order for the tumor cells to spread and create metastases, the cells go into the bloodstream, survive in the bloodstream, and then seed somewhere else. Ovarian cancer is different because the spread doesn't happen via the bloodstream. It actually happens via the abdominal cavity and the fluid in the abdominal cavity. And the new tumor deposits end up on the internal membranes there. So the fluid that we collect as ascites contains cells that are in the process of surviving and seeding new deposits that will cause problems. It also contains the growth signals and molecules that sustain those cells. And it came to it that eventually we put in our human research ethics, which took a while, and we included ascites as one of our research specimens. When we collect biospecimens, so tissue samples or tumor samples, a really typical situation is that there will be a tiny little bit of tissue from which we can extract a very small amount of DNA, and we need very sensitive methods to measure it. And there's really no scope to separate it between projects. Ascites is different. It accumulates in liter volumes. This is a photo of how we receive this as a biospecimen from the hospital. We provide the unit there with sterile 1 liter bottles, and they give us back a liter of ascites. I've never worked with this amount of material that we can analyze on any project. So what do we do with it? Here's the ascites sample with fluid, DNA, and cells. Firstly, we put it through a 40-micron filter. And what this does is captures clumps of cells, which are known from previous research to be mostly cancer cells. The single individual cells that go through this filter tend to be immune cells. These spheroids we isolate, and we can study them separately as the cancer cells that seed new metastases. We then spin this fluid again, and what it does is it brings the remaining immune cells to the bottom, but at the speed that we use, the DNA actually stays in solution. So we then end up with fractions of single cells and the cell-free DNA. Do you remember when I mentioned to you that we can't put our PCR assays on DNA breakpoints because the PCR won't work? It needs an intact DNA template. We're never able to use blood to design those for two reasons. One is the DNA is a tumor DNA, even in people with cancer, is a tiny fraction of the total, 0.1 to 10%. And there's really a limit in terms of the volume of blood that we can collect to extract it. Tumor DNA in ascites, on the other hand, is the majority of the DNA, well, appears to be the majority of the DNA present, and you see that we get it in liter volumes. So we are able to use the cancer DNA from the fluid to design our assays so that they work on DNA from the cells that have died. We were, from our group, one of our students, Bonnie Werner, this was her PhD, her honors project that then became her PhD project. We published the first paper where cell-free DNA from ascites was visualized and described. However, because there is so much of it, the thing that we've been able to do is share it with other researchers and other research groups so that now, in addition to the cell-free DNA breakage patterns for early detection, we're growing tumor cells directly from the ascites fluid, which some of our other students are using for drug testing. One of the exciting things is that not only can we test the drugs on the patient's cells, they can be growing in the patient's own ascites fluid. So everything is very similar to how you would see it physiologically. We have established a collaboration with we are in the process of establishing a collaboration with the University of Toronto, who are interested in components of ascites fluid. We've shared them with Dr. Omid Fardini at UNSW, who is using them to study single cells, and with Professor Stella Valenzuela at UTS, whose group is studying extracellular vesicles. With the amount of ascites fluid that's available, we should really know everything about the way that ovarian cancer metastasizes, survives, and spreads. We don't, because ovarian cancer is quite underfunded. So fundraising efforts are always very much appreciated. We have a website. Come and have a look, because the other way that you can support us, as you may remember, I mentioned that we are very dependent on blood donations from women in the community without ovarian cancer. We are always looking for blood donors. If you feel that this is something that you would like to do get in touch, and we'll be very happy to hear from you, especially if you're over 40. The younger blood donations from younger women are very welcome as well. So that brings me to the end of the presentation, and thank you once again to Janelle. It's really great to be here always.
Very much, Christina. Very interesting, very valuable work. Thank you, and I'll be a subject. So I'd like to invite all the speakers up now, so to have a Q&A session hosted by Kieran.
Thank you very much, Janelle. Good afternoon, everybody. For those of you who haven't met me before, my name is Kieran Rooney. I am head of discipline for exercise sports science and co-convener for the Sport and Physical Activity Research Teaching Network, acronized to Spartan, and here in the Faculty of Medicine and Health. And was also a long-time collaborator and co-teacher and friend of Helen's. And so it's been very exciting. Last year we started this symposium, this is Weighable Health Building, and it was particularly exciting this year to get endorsement by our fellow network leadership group in Spartan. So we know that this symposium will continue to run for at least the next few years in support of the faculty. Janelle and I have already started compiling a list of potential future speakers, and it was actually amazingly simple to come up with already a long list of people that we know, international and national experts in the area that directly work with Helen. So Kim and I will most likely keep your contact details from your registration and harass you for the next 5 to 10 years every time we have a symposium and keep you up to date. Before I throw over to the panel, I'd also like to point out, following on from Christina's wonderful presentation, that this symposium is running as also a fundraising opportunity for ovarian cancer research in honor of Helen. And we do have a link on the registration page for which you can go to donate. Of course, the people online could do that whilst we do the Q&A session. People in the room might have to wait till you get home. But that link will stay active, and we'll also remind people as we go through. Okay, so what I haven't got in front of me at the moment is the live Q&A from the Zoom, so I'm going to try and access that. But I'll throw over to the floor first. Were there any particular burning questions that anybody in the room would like to throw over to the panel? I have a roaming mic that I can run to you. No? I don't have to. I can take large strides.
Thank you.
Thank you everyone for your wonderful talks today. It's nice to understand everyone's talk and to have some familiarity. Sometimes I go to these symposiums and not tune out, but get very lost. So it's nice to follow along with all of you. Nikki, my question was for you in relation to the eating behaviour spectrum. This may be very naive. I'm not a dietitian. I'm an exercise physiologist, but is it a clinical decision as to where someone sits on the spectrum, or is there a series of surveys, questionnaires, or tools that you use to help assess where someone lies?
To diagnose someone with an eating disorder, it is a clinical assessment. As a sports dietitian, I don't do that. So doctors and psychologists who are trained to do so. The eating disorder examination, the EDE, is the gold standard in diagnosis of eating disorders. So yes, when you're diagnosing an eating disorder, there is criteria to meet the DSM-5. In terms of for the rest of the spectrum, so if I have an athlete that I think is living with an eating disorder and needs a diagnosis, I will refer on. Would you also like me to talk though about further down the spectrum?
In the context of where it kind of triggered for me, we're looking at shift workers and nurses and eating behaviour, and there's not a lot of tools available for shift workers. But we are looking at behaviours, and some of them will have very low calorie reports. So I guess if we were trying to replicate this in a non-athlete population, is there a series of
Yes, and so it depends on the population that you're after. So for us, and it's interesting within an athlete context, there aren't great screening tools for disordered eating. There is one that is coming out very soon. A PhD student from Melbourne has just validated it. So we're anxiously anticipating that being released. I would suggest you look at the population that you're interested in and see what exists out there, because there are lots of screening tools. It just depends on what the population that you're looking for.
So I'm going to throw one out from the Q&A online, and it's actually, I'm going to leave it with Nikki for the moment. It's an interesting question from Beth. Beth wonders if you could give any comment as to whether or not you think the clothing that the elite athletes are somewhat expected or forced to wear during international competition could be contributing to the development of the eating disorders.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's a factor for sure. Not just at the elite end. I think all the way down, uniform is a consideration and needs to be considered for athletes at all levels.
Thank you. Janelle, following on from the conversation about using these tools, you commented that your tool's ready, available for people to access. If somebody wanted to use that for a research study, is it as simple as being able to access that UCID link and find it there, or what are some of the, how would we use it best?
Accessing it depends on what you want from the tools. So they are publicly available, as I said, then they will give you the reports and feedback generally. If you wanted the data that goes underneath that, you would need to enter into a data sharing agreement with us. If you wanted to have access to the tools themselves, and that's a licensing agreement and a confidentiality agreement. So you can see what I'm saying about all the red tape and etc.
Excellent. So a wonderfully available tool that will just take a lot of admin and bureaucracy to get through. Thank you. Christina.
So I have a question from the panel about the athletes, elite athletes and eating patterns. At what age does somebody, I guess, move from being very enthusiastic about sport to being considered on the elite athlete path? And is there any predictive behaviors before that happens in the young women or girls, I guess, that might help to predict whether somebody will develop an eating disorder down the track?
First part of your question, it depends on the sport as to what is considered and at what age you become elite. So for something like artistic gymnastics, elite for a female can be at 16 years of age, whereas for rowers, it's often over 23 before they're considered elite. So it really depends on the sport as to what's elite and at what age. In terms of the predictive factors, and I didn't mention this, but in the diagram I had with the 3 circles and the genetic vulnerability and the psychology factors, there are known factors, which often we talk about elite athletes as being highly driven, on the obsessive compulsive end, single-minded focus, dedicated, but often elite athlete positive, but that are also linked with eating disorder development. So there are some of those personality traits, that perfectionism was the main one I meant to mention, that could be around that screening tool and identifying individuals. I think in the end, and it's one of the lines from the position statement, I think I probably said it a couple of times, that it can occur in any sport, any athlete in any sport at any time. And so, you know, within general population literature, we do know that adolescence is a very formative time and a high prevalence at that point. But I think we need to be very careful that we don't just focus on that age of population. Retirement and life after sport is a very big transition period for our elite athletes and can be very challenging, that whole athlete identity and the change in requirements around that. So I think that there is a lot that we could do in that predicting space, but also keeping that really broad approach of it can occur at any time within our athletes as well.
Thanks, Nikki. We have one from the floor.
I've lots of questions for Nikki, but you've been picked on, so I'm going to pick on Geraldine. I've been running an online e-health educational sort of thing too for the group that I work with. One thing I was interested in with yours, like, how do you motivate these people? They're already really busy, overwhelmed, overloaded, and just to do something else, like log on online. Like personally, I mean, just because I am a physio makes me motivated perhaps, but I'm just curious because I think, do you think this was a factor? Like there's not the social component, there's not the kind of, that there's not really, I just wondered what you did to kind of motivate them. I know you said you sent texts and told them what to do, but was there an element of that you're going to look at? Or?
Yeah, excellent question. The difficulty with behaviour is that it's complex. So there's not a one size fits all. So the planning of the intervention was to try and have as much variety as possible to try and tap into what would motivate a particular person. For some people, it might be accountability. For some people, it might be more information. And so within the information that we sent people was to try and build on certain particular strategies that might tap in with people. People who like the face-to-face interaction, even though it was an online intervention, we'd make suggestions about how to connect with people face-to-face. So it was about trying to provide a wealth of resources and tools for people and to be able to find what really motivates them. And for some people, it was just information about what the benefits were. Some people, it was the mental health aspect of the physical activity. So the website really had a lot of information and cross-linking to other sites. It would be great if there was a one fix tool, because then we wouldn't have this problem of physical inactivity, but it really is quite complex. I think the health coaching was really quite instrumental as well to help people navigate their way around the resources that we provided, but also to be quite strategic with the goals that they set with people. And admittedly, that's one limitation. It was a one-off health coaching session, but that was also to try and have people build on those particular strategies and action plans that they made with that health coach. Yeah, a requirement was that you needed the internet connection. You do need a mobile phone if you wanted to have the text. So that could be a limitation for people who aren't digitally orientated. Yeah, but I suppose the health coaching session would still guide people through other action points.
I had another question for you. So it's Helen Parker here from Exercise Sport Science. I guess the is this likely to be rolled out into some sort of New South Wales or Australia-wide thing? How much would it cost? Can it fit in with our current health system and our funding and things? And is there any sort of work being done in that sphere to roll it out to a larger thing than not just a study, but just a study?
Excellent question. And this is the next plan is to test this package, this program on a larger scale. So we were primarily testing how acceptable it was, how feasible it was, but because of our the number of people that we recruited, that's not enough to be a definitive answer for the effectiveness. So the next step is to do an effectiveness type trial and then to roll it out. It is actually quite cost effective. A website, automated messages, and possibly some little bit more development within trying to facilitate some social connection, but essentially it really is cost effective for prevention.
So Geraldine, just one last question for you then. Before we all roll it out, on one of your slides, you noticed that there were adverse events in a handful of your participants. Severe adverse events, you want to describe what they might have been like?
Some adverse events from being physically active is that you might pull a muscle, you might fall over. There are risks to physical activity in that you do have to get up and move and maybe stretch yourself or like extend yourself physically from what you're used to. So there was some pulled muscles. There was one person who had a fall. So they are the risks of being physically active, but only one needed hospitalization. So, well, she fell over. So.
Yep. Thank you. So Nikki, I'm going to read it back to you with a couple of questions from the Q&A. I'm going to conflate two of them. The first one is, how do you approach it if you have an athlete who's denying an eating disorder, despite what maybe your clinical reasoning might show? But then also, with many of us educating our next lot of undergraduates in this area, what tools or how do you think we should approach teaching an undergraduate student before they go out into the real world to prepare themselves for how they might approach such a topic with an athlete?
First one, if someone is denying they have a problem, they're what we call pre-contemplative. And it can be very hard, as we know, to work with someone in that space. But I think it comes back to our motivational interviewing and behaviour change. How do we approach someone who is in that pre-contemplative space? Personally, some ways in that I've had in the past is around sport performance for athletes. That's a very motivating factor for them. So if there is injury or illness or things that can be linked to a reduction in performance, that can help to move someone from pre-contemplative to contemplative, which is what we need for them to engage in treatment. So that's probably my first thing. The second part of your question was?
For many of us who are teaching undergraduate students in this space before they graduate, what tools might be available for us in our classes that we could use, or how do we prepare our students for this type of work?
I guess the question, I'd follow that up with a question, if I may, because I guess it depends on what area. So if your students aren't dietitians, psychologists, or doctors, then the treatment space is not where they're going to be. So if they're anyone outside of those three professions, which is exercise science, exercise physiology, I'm assuming is what you're pointing to, then very much those clinicians' role is in the prevention and early identification space. So from a prevention point of view, it depends on the area they're working in, but language forms a very big part of that. And the language we use when talking about athletes' bodies, like I said. So it's very it is role specific based on what your students are going to be doing. And then early identification, what are the signs and symptoms? How can you identify thought processes, behaviour changes in someone that might be of concern? So I think that from that exercise physiology and exercise science space, you're very much talking more prevention and early identification.
We probably have time for at least one, if not two more. So I'll throw it back over to Geraldine with one from the Q&A. If there's anybody in the room who wants to take the last question. Question was regarding the social aspect of exercise, whether or not your website and intervention encouraged group activities, or was it all very much individual activity based?
this intervention was an individual intervention, an individual program. So it wasn't group-based. I think further development of this program in the future could be to incorporate a group type meeting of the participants, say, for example, a private Facebook chat group or room, so people can share stories and be motivated by peers who are trying to achieve similar goals of being more physically active, to possibly look at locations where people can meet and walk. That might be a little bit scary sometimes to meet someone online to do that sort of thing, but perhaps, yeah, that's something that needs to be talked about within that Facebook chat group. But I think physical activity really is a social thing, and physical activity is a physical and mental health benefit. So it really is tying in both those two components. So there is quite a social aspect to being physically active.
Thank you. And we'll go with our last question from the floor.
Nikki, so some of the sports that you mentioned were higher risk. Many of the, I guess, inherent behaviors in those sports are along the lines of, say, tracking body composition, tracking eating behaviors. How do you go about distinguishing those inherent behaviors, performance-related behaviors, from, say, more of a pathological behavior?
It can be very hard, is my summary answer. Because you're exactly right. There are, and an example I like to give is that if a general population was exercising in inclement weather, that might be a red flag for, compulsive exercise. Our athletes are asked to exercise and train no matter what the weather. So there are definitely nuances within high performance sport and elite athletes. And when I say high performance sport, I mean, I am talking about anyone who is training for a goal. If someone's training for an Ironman, then there are times where what we might think is a concerning behavior is actually part of what they need to do for their job as an athlete. So it is hard and it is nuanced, and it's about understanding the context of what the athlete is experiencing. And I think that's what it's really important that it comes back to, is what's the impact that it's having on the athlete, on their mental and physical health. So it can be very hard. Is a good question.
Right, thank you very much, Nikki. So if I could ask everybody in the room to give one more thanks to our four speakers, to Janelle, Geraldine, Thank you very much for a wonderful series of presentations. There's also an opportunity for networking and just outside for those of us here in person. Otherwise online, I also like to say thank you to everybody who joined in and also posted questions in the Q&A. And just a reminder once again that if you do have the opportunity that there is a fundraising link for the event to give to the Ovarian Cancer Research Foundation. And otherwise, I'll see you again next year. Thank you.